pretty certain when you're north of 50 employees and certainly up to 150 employees, this isn't about you anymore. I think, Mary, one of the things we talked about in episode number 1 of this series is establishing culture, right?
Right.
It's getting payroll right, but establishing culture. What is it you're going to build this business around? And when you're as the founder, the owner, the senior leader, you're kind of the epicenter of culture. You get to have a big impact just on cult of personality, right? Um,
Right.
but now you're relying on managers who manage other people whom you might not know all that well, maybe at all, to help carry that culture. Welcome to Mission to Grow, the small business guide to cash, compliance, and the war for talent. I'm your host, Mike Vannoy. Each week, we'll bring you experts in accounting, finance, human resources, benefits, employment law, and more. You'll learn ways to access capital through creative financing and tax strategies, tactical information you need to stay compliant with ever-changing employment laws, and people strategies you need to win the war for talent. Mission to Grow is sponsored by Assure. Assure helps more than 100,000 businesses get access to capital, stay compliant, and develop the talent they need to grow. Enjoy the show. HR roadmap for growing your business at every stage. We are in part 3 of a 3-part series unpacking the ebook of that same title. And 2 weeks ago, we covered growing from 1 to 15 employees. Last week, 16 to 49 employees. Today, we're unpacking 50 to 149 employees. So call it 50 to 150 employees. As you grow your business from one stage to another, it comes with different requirements, and there's different areas that you should be focusing on as an entrepreneur, as a business owner, as a manager. And so we just want to unpack what are the specific HR things you should be thinking about as you either plan to enter or are in this stage of 50 to 150 employees. If you're a regular watcher of the show, Brian Shenker and Mary Simmons, our esteemed guests to help you unpack this topic. So if I invite everybody to follow along, hop on assuresoftware.com, resources, follow along in the ebook. Mary, maybe we'll start with you. What are the big HR, and let's maybe think strategic, not just there's a whole bunch of laws we're going to unpack that when you cross the employee threshold, but just strategically, what should businesses be thinking about from an HR perspective as you enter this more than 50 employees phase?
Yeah, thanks, Mike. It's a great question. And I think one of the basic, and it's going to sound overly basic, but you have to now have an HR function. So maybe below 50 employees, you could do HR light. We talked about in the other sections that you should have a handbook. I think that's pretty basic. But now that you have 50 plus employees, and as Brian unpacks some of the laws, you need a real HR function. So what do I mean by that? You need somebody who is either certified or experienced in the HR world to set up an HR function that helps you, number one, be compliant. But number two, now we have 50 employees. We need them to be productive. Right? So what are we setting up as far as expectations? What are we setting up as far as disciplinary, performance management, et cetera? All of that comes together to mean that you have a real HR function.
Yeah, right. Brian, how about you? What are some of the big, more strategic considerations businesses need to be thinking about as they go from enter this 50 employees and then on up to 150?
Sure. Well, of course, for me, from the defense litigation standpoint, I'm thinking more employees, more potential issues. And that speaks to what Mary said, that we really need to have our HR processes in place, potentially, more streamlined, because, HR, whether it's one person or multiple, as you grow, it's, harder and harder to, maintain with, each HR event that's occurring. So I think it's important to have this framework set up as you're getting to this area so that you're not scrambling, once you have so many employees and, having HR issues. Certainly you're going to start hitting some of the federal statutes that have higher thresholds, and even other statutes that might not be based on employees, like maybe the Fair Labor Standards Act. You're going to have more potential exposure because you likely have multiple employees in certain positions. And so if you're making a mistake in HR now, it might not just be affecting one person. It might be a whole group of employees, which,
Right.
exponentially increases that exposure.
One of the things that I think about is, you can go it alone as a leader. Like when you start, hang out a shingle for yourself, you might have zero employees. You're the individual contributor, you're the boss, you're the strategist, you're the janitor, you're everything. And you still wear a lot of hats as you go from, 1 to 5 to 15 to 25 and grow. But pretty certain when you're north of 50 employees and certainly up to 150 employees, this isn't about you anymore. I think, Mary, one of the things we talked about in episode number 1 of this series is establishing culture, right? Is getting payroll right, but establishing culture. What is it you're going to build this business around? And when you're as the founder, the owner, the senior leader, you're kind of the epicenter of culture. You get to have a big impact just on cult of personality, right?
Right.
But now you're relying on managers who manage other people whom you might not know all that well, maybe at all, to help carry that culture. What do you guys have to say about that? About this, dare I say, introduction of managers, and all of a sudden there's a layer between you and the front line.
I'll jump in here. I'm sure Brian has a point of view too, but for me, as an HR professional, this is where you need more training, right? We always say that we want to train managers to manage people, not just to manage process. So if I hire a foreman, let's say in a manufacturing setting, he probably knows or she knows how to make that manufacturing line go quickly. But do they know how to motivate, coach, counsel, train those employees, and then manage that within a compliant framework? They probably could use some reminders and some assistance. So as you get bigger, as you said, Mike, the leadership team is further from a lot of the workers, right? They may be interacting with the higher level managers or the mid managers, but maybe not as many employees. So we really need to make sure that we are training those managers to manage people compliantly within the culture that we've set forth, and to be productive, of course.
Now, both of you talked about, that, Mary, you said setting up a formal, real deal, say SHRM certified HR function, and they use the word function. Brian, I think you used the word processes. Paint a picture for what that might look like. And it's not an overt advertisement for us, Mary. This is what your team does for clients every single day. But the resources are very different for a 51 employee company versus 149 employee company. When you say the function, what is that? What are the buckets of that function?
Absolutely. Another great question. And I'm glad that Brian said process, because the processes are part of the function, right? So the HR function is the overreaching department that is going to drive the compliance and the productivity of your department. But if we don't have process, then anything that we do there is going to take too much time, be disorganized. It might fight our culture. It might fight the goal, which is to make a productive team. So when you set up that HR function, you're first going to look at what is the compliance that we have to adhere to, state, federal, and municipal, right? How are we going to set forth that compliance? So that's your overreaching umbrella. But then you want to dig in and you want to say, what are the other things that fall under that HR function that's going to help protect our organization and help drive the ROI to growth, right? So that's your performance management. That's your total comp, right? So how are we attracting, engaging, and retaining staff? And then at the end of the employment relationship, how are we handling terminations, right? Are we doing that compliantly, culturally sound, right? Because everybody sees when you terminate somebody.
Yeah.
So you want to make sure, number one, that you do it compliantly, but the other piece is, are you doing it in a manner that is, in line with your culture?
Yeah. Brian, anything you'd add there?
No, I think that's absolutely right. And, you have these processes, and I go back to what Mary said earlier about the manager training, because I think that's one big issue when you start getting to the size is that, when you're under 50, HR can always be involved, and, many requests for lead and things like that might go directly to HR. Whereas now you have, supervisors, mid-level managers who might need training on, for instance, we'll get to it later, FMLA and what
Right.
triggers an FMLA request. And so, they really need to understand these managers more than the job and the performance. They need to understand the compliance obligations the company has too, because now they're part of that. HR without managers that have an idea what they're doing is going to be really hamstrung to comply.
What are some of the challenges that you see companies face at this size? I mean, two things pop out for me is, okay, we acknowledge, we are at a certain stage. We need some real deal HR. So maybe I have a full-time equivalent employee that this is what they do. They're SHRM certified. Maybe it's fractional, but I outsource part of this and I outsource part of that. There's different ways that you can stitch this together. But simply having processes documented doesn't mean I follow those processes. And while the three of us certainly would be advocating from day one, first employee, that you're documenting everything, I think realistically, we know that especially smaller firms where the owner is wearing many, many hats, that's not always the case. So I think maybe frame it in the start in documentation and actually walking your talk and following these processes that you've documented. What are some of the challenges that you see firms face in those areas?
I would say that I think a lot of times when you get into this 50 to 150 or 51 to 149 space, the organizations sometimes have grown fast. And although they recognize they need HR, they still operate like they're a smaller business. So
Sure.
one of the things that I think can assist these organizations when they grow is to utilize data and collect data and act on that data. For example, we talk all the time about it being a very tough environment right now to attract the best talent, right? We might get a lot of applications, but we're not finding the best talent can be difficult. So what we try to, preach and teach is to utilize data. You have to keep data of where you're posting your ads, which ads you're posting, what verbiage you're using, what platforms, and then what is the outcome from each. That's just one example, right? And then you want to follow that employee through their life cycle, right? You want to keep data by doing stay interviews, for example, or employee engagement surveys, and use that data to inform, oh, that was the best place to hire. That's where these high potential candidates came from. And then double down on those and maybe stop using another. And recruitment is just one area where I want organizations to collect data. Another on the other end of the employment relationship is termination. So are you doing exit interviews? We utilize a tool so that we can collate that data, go back to the employer and say, look, everybody's leaving because they don't like XYZ manager. We need to do management training or executive coaching with that manager, or the salary. Everybody's leaving for salary. Let's do benchmarking. You cannot guess in your HR function anymore. You have to gather data and utilize that data, use that to inform your decisions that you make to make that HR function better.
Yeah, makes perfect sense. Brian, how about you? What are the challenges firms entering this phase face?
I think, similar to what Mary said, I mean, certainly another data point is wages. I think that as they grow bigger, I mean, a couple issues. One, obviously compliance, with, federal and state wage laws. But I think too, as you grow and have more employees and start developing departments, it's really good to do, a wage audit. Number one, make sure classifications are good, but also you're going to have to start understanding compensation levels and really do, compensation studies. Are you paying market rate? These things, start becoming bigger issues, as you're growing. More is often expected from employees and applicants of, larger companies. So you want to make sure you're keeping up with that as well. Another area that I see is, especially, when FMLA becomes involved at this level, there are a lot of leave laws to manage, both federal, state, and now, many local ones. So I think, more employees means many more, requests for leave and issues that will come up. And you really need likely a designated person, to handle those when, these getting up to, 100 or more.
I want to probably spend most of the rest of the time on compliance, because when there's something about this 50 employee mark that all of a sudden triggers a whole bunch of laws. I mean, you have to comply with Fair Labor Standards Act from day one, OSHA day one. There's a lot of them that, big federal regulations. It doesn't matter how big or small, you must comply. You can't discriminate. You can't have an unsafe work environment. So those things, but there's you triple wire that there's all kinds of new ones. So we're going to spend probably the majority of our time on that. The last thing, maybe I just want your guys' thoughts about how do you guide an entrepreneur or a manager running a company like you said, Mary, it's a fast growth firm. Things just change. I used to be, say, the office manager. Well, now there's a payroll clerk, there's an HR person, there's an accounts receivable person, there's a billing person. I mean, the jobs by definition become more specialized and fractionalized. It's my sense that as that happens, it'd be really easy to skip over salary benchmarking, job descriptions, performance management expectations as these jobs change over time, and you end up with people misclassified, out of bed on comp, don't even have the right expectations set. What I mean, I see you nodding. Give me some validation agreement, but what's your guidance here?
Yeah, I mean, I think, look, it's definitely challenging, and we talked about it when you're a smaller organization, and let's say, the three of us plus 10 more people are running a company. We're all wearing a lot of hats. That has its own unique challenges. Now, when we get bigger, and like you said, it probably is the time to review job descriptions, which, I preach they should be looked at every single year.
Yeah.
And, who's doing what. So now you have other challenges, which is now we're getting bigger. So, how can we be the most efficient? What are the steps in a succession plan, right? Now we're big enough to actually have succession planning, because we're going to have some key positions that if that individual leaves for whatever reason, we've got a problem. So I always caution organizations of this size to make sure that they have some succession planning. And again, that's going to double back to the training, but it's going to probably include, instead of just management training, some skills training. And there's a lot of different ways that we can do that. And I also encourage organizations like this to, when we talk about attracting the best talent, now you really have to be aware of your total compensation. It's not just salary. It never was just salary. It's, what are the benefits of working at the organization for the individual? Training is something that the Gen X's and Gen Zs want. So there's another reason to do training. But, what's in it for the employee? And then how does that tie to where we want to go and how we want to grow? So I think that the succession planning just becomes all that more important. And you can't really do succession planning without performance management, because I don't know if Mike and Brian are high potential unless I have an evaluation and a good solid appraisal of their work. Then I know where can they go in my organizational chart as people move on or move up.
That's a great one, Mary. It's as you're saying, it's I don't think it's necessarily intuitive. Of all the things you think about, okay, you cross this 50 employee threshold. What are the things you should be planning for? Succession planning. I can see how that can feel like a big company thing to do, but man, if you're a 7,500 person company and you lose a really key employee, massive impact, right? Not that it's not when it's a smaller company, but it's a different dynamic. So you need it for productivity to protect against a potential loss. But how do you retain that institutional knowledge and move people into roles? And maybe for this job, it's not just a climbing of the ladder. Maybe we need a tour of duty here and a tour of duty here to give them the experience that they need to go there, right? So thinking that stuff through makes a whole lot of sense. Brian, what would you add to the succession planning?
I think as a general concept, kind of not just giving lip service to HR and really embracing the HR, function here, right? I know, Mary and I have each seen, companies as they grow, they might have an HR department, but, the HR department doesn't have much power and they're somewhat ignored. And it's more like a checking of the box, so to speak. And
Sure.
I think that, here, as you get bigger, there's a lot more delegation that has to occur, right? So the owners who wanted their hands in, every, employment decision, you're going to have to back away a little bit on those things and, trust the people who are going through these processes, right? That, trust that you have a process for investigating a complaint and someone's going to do that. And that, when you're lining up to terminate someone, right, there should be a process and, making sure it's going to be a lawful, compliant termination. And so I think oftentimes those things can't occur unless, the owners and those running the company give HR the opportunity to do that. And I've seen a number of times, somewhat interfering with that. And, not only does that, result in cultural issues within the organization, but a lot of compliance challenges.
Yeah, great. Guys, let's move on, and I'll guide everybody else following along online. It's page 13 in the ebook. We got a whole page of just these are major federal laws. And yes, they're all federal. We do take a nod to state laws because, man, that list is just exploding. But there are some new federal laws when you cross this 50 employee threshold that I think are really important to unpack. Each of these could be its own 1 hour episode. So we'll try to get through them here in our remaining time. So FMLA, Family Medical Leave Act, Affordable Care Act, ACA reporting, a nuance on the ACA, Form 5500, affirmative action plans, news alert. A new president just signed an executive order that's going to blow that one up on us since this thing went live. We'll talk about that. EEO reporting, and then just how should we be thinking about state laws? So, Brian, let's let you start as our legal expert with maybe Family Medical Leave Act for the employer who has just crossed this threshold for the first time. What do they need to know?
Right. So let's first talk about eligibility, right? And if you're going to be covered. So to be a covered employer, you need to have 50 or more employees within a 75-mile radius. So that means, if you have 25 employees in California and 25 in New York, you're not going to be subject to it. But if you have them within that 75-mile radius, now you have the FMLA to deal with. Employee eligibility, on the other side, requires employees to be employed for 12 12 months of service, working 1,250 total hours in the last 12 months. And if they meet that, then they're entitled to 12 weeks of unpaid leave. And so, getting to, the type of leave, right? Eligible employees get 12 weeks of unpaid leave in, that 12-month period. I believe that's increases to, I believe it's 26 weeks to care for an injured service member. And this leave can be taken for specific family and medical reasons, right? Of either, the employee or their family, things like, birth or adoption of a foster care child within the first 12 months, the employee or the employee's family member's serious health condition. And so there is a whole process that the company needs to set up in place for requesting leave, for determining and certifying if leave comes under the FMLA, and then notifying the employee. So there are a lot of steps, right? So typically the FMLA will be triggered by an employee request, right? And there are no magic words. And this is what we were talking about earlier when you need your, managers to be on the lookout for these types of things, right? Because this could be the employee's own health condition. It could be, an absence due to, a child placement, or it could be, frequent absences or tardiness due to a family member's health issues. So the employee does not have to mention FMLA. So it's important that managers understand, what serious health conditions are, and what things can be that come up under this. So, and then there's certainly complications in terms of compliance where, employees don't have to take a 12-week block of leave. It can be intermittent leave, which means, you have situations where, an employee can be there, 4 days a week and out 1 day a week. And so there are lots of things that need to be managed as part of this. Not to mention the potential for the leave to become paid. So as I mentioned before, FMLA leave alone, it's unpaid, but an employer can require that employees use paid leave during that FMLA leave. So if, the employee has available PTO, they can be, elect to use that.
So I think all three of us have done entire 1-hour episodes on this topic. Would encourage, I'll ask my team to include in the show notes for whichever platform you're watching, YouTube or our website or otherwise, that you can drill into and double click on that on FMLA if you want. I think the big thing here, if you're new over the 50 employee line, it's to know a couple things. If you must comply, then go down the rabbit hole and figure out which employees are eligible, what they're eligible for. The biggest thing you need to understand is if you have more than 50 employees within a 70-mile radius, then you must comply. Tell me if I got this right. If the federal government in its thinking here is maybe you're 150 employee, maybe you have 200 employees, but you have 10 locations spread all over the place. And so just a few employees each. If you were to lose any one employee, it could be devastating. You would have a need to backfill them. But if you have that many employees geographically together, it's reasonable to assume you can backfill folks, right? And so it's not quite as punitive. And that's kind of the rationale of the law. Mary, you agree with that?
Yeah, I would say so. I'm not sure they were thinking, how easy it is for the employer, but yes, I think that's it. And listen, we're talking a lot about productivity because it's important when you're a company that big, paying that many employees. Productivity is important, right? We need the profits to stay afloat, and the leaves, can, be difficult for organizations because although you could bring a temp person on, to replace the person. You shouldn't be replacing the person because they come back to the same or a very similar job.
Right.
So, if you're a 50 employer and you have 5 people out on FMLA, that can be very difficult to keep your productivity
Right.
where you had it. So, that's something that every employer of this size has to think about. How do I keep productivity where it needs to be, given that now there's more leaves that the employees can take? And we've talked about other leaves on shows, and Brian has with you. Sick leaves are increasing. You have the Pregnancy Act that we talked about. So there's a lot of leaves that employees can take, thank goodness. But the flip side of it is, how do the employers stay productive?
Is there anything else? So if I'm an employer, I'm listening here. Hey, I'm about to cross over this 50 mark, or I just crossed over the 50 mark. We encourage you, go down this rabbit hole and learn what you must know, because you've got to comply. But anything else about the employer requirement? So more than 50 employees within a 50-mile radius, anything around industry or full-time equivalency? Does it matter if they're part-timers?
No, so not here. We'll get to that when we get to the ACA.
Yeah.
But here, the other main employer obligation is to restore the employee to the same or an equivalent position upon return from the leave, rather.
Yeah.
And so that's certainly a big one. And again, that goes to kind of what Mary is speaking to, that these people are going to be out for some period of time, and to maintain production, you need someone to step in. So, when you get to this size, cross-training employees, having them shadow other workers to understand, other related roles, could be very useful, when, a key employee takes leave.
Yeah. All right. Punchline here. If you got more than 50 employees, part-time or full-time, doesn't matter, within 70 miles of a single place of business, you're going to have to comply with the Family Medical Leave Act, FMLA. Do a deep dive here because there's a lot to know. There's a lot of nuance here of how you administer this leave, and how this may or may not play nicely with your local and state laws, and what leave types, other leave types you must comply with, paid or otherwise.
And I would add, Mike, don't forget, now you need a handbook policy for FMLA, and it should be included. I would post it in an employee area.
Yeah. We just need to get a big neon hat for you that says employee handbook flashing up, because it's true, right? Because every one of these, every policy, every procedure, every best practice, certainly every law that you've got to comply with needs to be in a handbook. So good catch, Mayor. Brian, you mentioned the ACA, the Affordable Care Act. So a lot of people know, but just give us a brief definition of what it is, and a little bit different in our definition here of still a 50 employee tripwire, but there's something different about these 50 employees.
Exactly. So before we get to the employee issue, we'll start with, what the basics are of the ACA. And really, the main part of it's the employer mandate. So if your company is an applicable large employer, an ALE, again, we'll get to how you determine that. Then you must provide health benefits to workers that are both that meet minimum value and affordability standards, or else you will face tax penalties if such coverage is not offered. So obviously, it's very important to understand these requirements, and to understand if your business qualifies as an ALE, and you need to get ahead of this, right? This isn't one where you want to find out after the fact, oh, we had 50 full-time equivalents. You need to be measuring this, understand when you're coming up against it, so you can plan. So that brings us to who has to comply. So the majority of the ACA's requirements apply to businesses with 50 or more full-time equivalents. So again, right, as we mentioned in the FMLA, that just counts employees Doesn't matter if they're part-time or full-time. But here we need to look into that. And there is a calculation that follows. So essentially, the steps to determine if you are subject to ACA, you need to count up your full-time and part-time employees in the following way. So first, count up all your full-time employees who are working an average of 30 or more hours a week in a given month, right? So for each month, you determine which of these employees are working those 30 or more hours a week, and that's going to be your full-time figure. Second, you need to count your full-time equivalents. So for each month of the last calendar year, you'll add up all the non-full-time employees up to a max and add their hours of service up to a maximum of 120 hours per employee per month. And then we divide that by 120 and we get our full-time equivalents per month. Then we add those full-time equivalents and the full-time employees together for the last 12 months, and we divide by 12, and we have our average number of full-time equivalents per month. And if that is 50 or greater, for the prior year on average, then you're going to be subject to the employer mandate. I know that's a lot, but, employers should really look into, understanding how to count this because, there are significant penalties for, failing to offer coverage to employees that should have been, offered affordable.
So the entrepreneur who's driving their car listening to this podcast, they thought, man, that's super mathy. Net it out. So unlike FMLA, if I have more than 50 employees within a 70-mile radius, doesn't matter if they're full-time or part-time, I've got to comply with FMLA. Give me the grossly oversimplified definition, the non-lawyer version. Mary, I'm gonna have to pivot to you because Brian won't be able to help himself here.
No, he's
What's
perfect.
I like Buster.
Right. So, I mean, the basic premise is, right, so you could have, 50, 40 part-time employees and 10 full-times. And depending on the hours that these people work, you may or may not hit ALE status. So I think it's, it's where you don't want to assume you don't meet it. But I think you can certainly have more than 50 employees and still not be an ALE. So that's the other side of this, right? You hit 50 employees under the FMLA within 75-mile radius, you're subject to that. Here, even though you might have 50 or 60 or 70 employees, you really have to run through this calculation because don't assume that you have to offer coverage. There may be reasons an employer wants to offer, health coverage, but it may be, hey, based on the prior year's averages, we're not subject to it this year, and we don't see tremendous value in offering health insurance, so it could be a big savings. So that's why it's really important. Forgetting about the math, just understand that even if you have over 50 employees, you may not be required to comply with the employer mandate.
So punchline, FMLA, more than 50 employees within 70 miles, you got to comply. ACA, the answer is it depends, and there is a black and white formula. It might not be super simple if you're not used to it. For those of you who are used to it, it's not that hard. It's pretty straightforward. If you have 50 employees, you should find out the formula and do the calculations to see if you have to comply, because it's possible to have more than 50 employees and not have to comply. It's not really possible to have fewer than 50 employees and have to comply. Is that fair to say?
That's fair to say, yeah.
Yeah. So I think the punchline here is know the rule, know the formula, do the calculation. Mary, what's your guidance here on dare we say newcomers to the ACA?
I'm going to add that I think offering medical benefits is probably one of the most compelling reasons to attract employees and the best employees, right, to your organization. Everybody needs medical coverage.
Yeah.
Not everybody can get it from their partner. So offering the medical benefits is I think, an investment in the best talent that you can get in your organization.
And I know it's a divestiture, but in today's war for talent, I mean, employers, I don't think the employers were ever like so cold blooded. They're like, screw their employees. I don't have to. I'm not going to. But there was realities of supply and demand of labor, and businesses generally operate on as thin a margin as they can to survive and compete against their competitors and still have some profit left over. So in the past, I think this wasn't necessarily even an option for so many people. But I feel like that dynamic has just changed so much, where even small employers kind of expected, if you can't offer benefits, then you're not going to be able to get staff, and therefore they're baking the cost of those benefits into their goods and services, right?
Correct.
Yeah. Okay. Brian, anything else on ACA before we talk about its follow-up, its partner, ACA reporting?
No, I think we can move on to that. Sure.
All right, let's talk. So there's the Affordable Care Act. We talked basically what that is. What is ACA reporting then?
Right. So under the ACA and reporting, we're mainly looking at IRS form 1095. And so basically any ALE that, that's offering, full-time employees, health coverage, as they should, they need to report to the IRS information about, coverage to employees, so that the IRS can determine if the employer may or may not owe a penalty for, not offering coverage. So there's also, 1094C, which is, one form per tax ID, and it requires information, such as the number of people employed and, how many, people are receiving coverage. So, there's a lot of information that needs to be filed with the IRS. There are also some states that will require, tax filings with respect to ACA reporting. Some of those states include Washington, D.C., California, and New Jersey, and I believe Massachusetts as well. So be careful that your state may have additional reporting requirements. And really going hand in hand with these reporting requirements are notice requirements to employees. There's the notice of marketplace coverage options that's provided to all new employees. Summary of benefits coverage. And, a lot of this stuff is, may come from the health insurer, but as the employer, you should still need to be aware of this and ensure employees, are getting these notices. And of course, these IRS filings come with, significant penalties, if, there are filings late or, not at all. So that's why you certainly want to know whether you're an ALE subject to these requirements, because it's one issue not to provide the coverage and another issue not to file any of these required forms, and you're going to get hit with penalties on both ends. So,
Mary, it's my sense that this is the place where maybe employers get in more trouble than just the law itself, which does either mandates that I do or don't provide health benefits to my employees. I mean, some people maybe get that determination wrong, but I think for the most part, people get the determination right, and then they're not putting together their own health plans. They're using brokers who are going to help them provide compliant health plan packages. But they really screw up sometimes when it comes to the ongoing reporting requirements, and this is where people get fined and get in trouble. Am I thinking about that right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, listen, I've been doing this for a really long time. And when I listen to Brian, I get the feeling that I would assume some of our listeners do, which is, yeah, I really do need a real HR person, right? It's it's not meant to be difficult. It's meant to have a process so that, employers follow the law, right? And the only way to ensure that is to have this process where they file these forms. But it's not easy, especially when an employer, no matter how many employees they have, and at this juncture, we're talking about 51 to 149.
Yeah.
They have a lot to do. Everybody's busy, and they have their own specialty. So to me, if what they listened to with Brian didn't convince everybody, that what I said at the beginning, that we really need a strong HR foundation and an expert in that seat, I don't know what else could help you come to that conclusion.
Yeah. I'm going to move us to the next one. It's another reporting requirement. It's the Form 5500. I won't try to explain it. Brian, tell us what the hell is Form 5500 and why should people care?
Sure. So this form is typically is filed by businesses that sponsor retirement plans and hold plan assets, and they need to file these. But it's also a form that may be required for certain employer-sponsored health and welfare plans, including medical, dental, life insurance, and and other fringe benefits. And so this is an annual reporting requirement to the IRS, and it basically provides the government with details about, in the case of a retirement plan, the plan's financial condition, investments and operations. But again, if you have, for instance, a medical plan and you have more than 100 participants, then now it goes outside of the retirement plan area. And now, as the employer, I will have to file a 5500 form with respect to the the medical plan we're providing.
Yeah.
And so again, this applies to most public and private businesses. Again, especially providing plans to 100 or more employees. There's a condensed version, a shortened version that applies to plans with fewer than 100. And then there's also a form. It's called the 5500 Easy form, which I suppose is more straightforward because that applies if you only have the owner. But at this point, we're way beyond that. We're at the point where you're going to be filing either the short form or the full form, depending on the number of employees and what type of plans you may have.
So just to be clear for everybody, Form 5500, if you live in, say, a state that has, which is almost half the states in the country, and now the list is growing, that mandate retirement plans. It varies a little bit on size of company, but increasingly it's going to smaller and smaller companies that states are mandating you need to provide retirement plans for your employees. I think everybody kind of gets the punchline here that Social Security might not be everything is cracked up to be as younger generations out of the workforce. So the states are trying to provide a safeguard for the employees of the businesses in their state. So that said, if you have a state mandated plan, could even be an IRA, right? If you're deducting money out of your employees' accounts for, and you're the plan sponsor or you're part of a state plan, you got to file a 5500. I know in the case of like a Sure 401k, we file that, we provide that 5500 on behalf of the client. I think most retirement plans, the Fidelities, the JP Morgans, they provide this service, but it is something that the business owner still needs to be aware of, right?
Certainly, because there are penalties for filing late or not at all, and you want to make sure it's accurate. There are penalties for inaccurate information, especially willful or omitted information, and just a note to employers. Right, this will typically be due the last day of the 7th month after the plan ends. So if you're on a calendar year plan, then it would be due every July 31st.
Yeah. Okay. I want to talk EEO reporting. I'm just looking at the clock here. Let's just spend a minute on EEO. Then let's talk about our last point. on affirmative action, because I think we're going to need a whole new episode on this based on just the president's actions last week. So, Mary, but what is it that, okay, I'm over 50 employees. What do I need? Why do I care? Why do I need to be concerned about EEO reporting now versus when I was a smaller organization?
Well, mostly because there's a federal mandate that at 100 employees, you have to fill out the EEO-1 report. And they just changed it recently, which is a good thing. And now there's a portal to go into. And this is something we do all day, every day for clients in the correct time frame, of course. It's not every day. But, it can be confusing. It's gathering a lot of data. And handing it over to the government. So, is your organization, keeping that data? Where is that data? How do you collect it? When do you collect it? How do you put it in the portal? There's quite a few nuances to it that if an employer never did it, it would be confusing. I also feel like, I think a lot of people have heard of FMLA, Family Medical Leave Act. But the EEO-1 reporting, when I get on calls with clients that are north of 100 employees, I'd say 50% know about it. So I'm not quite sure why that is, but that happens with a lot of employment laws that, business owners or the C-suite are focusing on growing the organization. They don't have the expertise or the wherewithal to handle the HR function. And this is just another one of those items that has to be done. It's mandated by the federal government, right? So all employers of 100 plus need to do it.
I never thought about it, but that makes sense. We know small businesses get in trouble. They don't know what they don't know. The entrepreneur, the founder, the owner of the business is hands-on in the business, wearing many hats, and they just don't know the HR laws. I think it's fairly well socialized, this 50 employee mark. That, okay, now there's a bunch of new stuff. And I think you just hit a natural point in your organization. It's like, man, I just got to have somebody who can help me with my people stuff, whether it's the job posting, the job descriptions, the interview, the performance management. I think there's this natural inertia that happens. And probably now we forget about crossing that 100 employee threshold, right? A new requirement. Brian, anything else you want to add on EEO before we close on affirmative action?
No, I think Mary covered it. I mean, I agree. There's the demographic data sometimes seems simple, but yeah, you've got to really understand how to do this the right way and how to report it. It's not just you have data, here it is. It's a bit more complex than that.
All right, let's take this last one, and I think we really do need to schedule sometime in the near term as we learn a little bit more, so we can give good, at least as concrete as possible, guidance to businesses around affirmative action. Let's start with, let's go backwards 10 days here, 2 weeks before the executive order was signed. What was the law for affirmative action? And then we'll start unpacking a little bit what's changed and maybe how we should be thinking about this right now.
Sure. So, affirmative action plans. So, we speak of the Office of Federal Contract Compliance Programs, the OFCCP, is the big agency here, which, again, going back 10 days, right, they require, certain government contractors and subcontractors to develop and maintain affirmative action plans. Typically, these are developed within the first, 3 or 4 months of the commencement of a contract. They're updated periodically. And there are 3 main laws that we look at, federally that require, certain affirmative action plans. So again, stepping back in time, to last year, we'll say there's Executive Order 11246, which is probably the main one here, which is affirmative action plans for, where there are 50 or more employees and a government contract of, 50,000. Then you have Section 503 of the Rehabilitation Act, which deals only with individuals with disabilities, and similar 50 or more employees and at least 50,000 in government contract. Then lastly, you have the Vietnam era Veterans Readjustment Assistance Act. And again, that applies, it requires affirmative action plans if there are 50 or more employees and a government contract of 150 or more, 150,000 or more. So that's how things were. And just to be clear, you know, the Executive Order 11246, right, that applied to yeah, to a lot of employees here, and you know, it revolved around race and gender, right, Mary?
Yeah.
And so enter, you know, this past week, President Trump signed an executive order entitled "Ending Illegal Discrimination and Restoring Merit-Based Opportunity." And basically, the executive order's stated purpose was to, you know, end illegal diversity, equity, and inclusion, essentially together called, you know, DEI, as we know. And so, yeah, the executive order does not change existing law regarding, you know, discrimination in contracting, employment, or otherwise. So I think it's real important to mention that, right? I think instead, you know, the administration, based on this executive order, is looking to target organizations that, you know, may violate existing anti-discrimination laws in their employment practices. And so I think the key issue here, based on, you know, this recent executive order, is, you know, there's issues certainly with DEI practices for private employers, based on what the executive order says. And the executive order also revoked Executive Order 11246, which was the primary executive order on contractor affirmative action plan obligations. So, you know, I think, as you mentioned, Mike, we certainly will need to follow this up, you know, as there's more guidance and we understand, you know, the executive order and, you know, what's coming next a bit more. But, you know, basically, you know, the executive order bars federal contractors from considering race, sex, preference, you know, sex, sexual preference, religion, or national origin in their employment, procurement, and contracting services in, quote, ways that violate the nation's civil rights laws. So, you know, we'll have to monitor this. I think employers should stay tuned, understand there is some changes with respect to some affirmative action plans. But again, let's be very clear. This does not eliminate the OFCCP as an agency or take away any, you know, contractor non-discrimination obligations. You know, so I think, you know, that's certainly important. You know, there is part of the executive order that states, you know, certain new provisions will be put into future contracts by the government. You know, we will wait to see exactly what those look like. So certainly, you know, guidance would be to review new contracts for, you know, relevant EEO and DEI terms. You know, and private employers should also look at their own DEI programs and review their employment practices to ensure, you know, they comply with, you know, non-discrimination statutes.
That's really what, and Mary, I want your input here because I think whether you're a really large employer or a small one, if you do a significant amount of work with the federal government, the procurement process is fairly legalistic, and you have to understand that process just to, you know, to play, right? So I think those large employers, well, over 50 employees doing government contracts, they probably are pretty well versed here and don't need our help. It's probably those that are now over 50 employees, that implemented their own DEI, what they consider to be best practices. And we're not taking any sides here. We just want to give the best practical advice. So whether you love or you hate this executive order from President Trump, we just want to give the best legal advice we possibly can. And sometimes not even legal, just the best practice. Mary, what would be your guidance for an employer who had their own just DEI policy that they're trying to do right in the world here, and how should they be interpreting this executive order?
I mean, I think on its face, DEI speaks to just staying adhering to EEOC practices and best practices. I think where organizations may go awry is when they don't hire, promote, or give equal conditions of employment to individuals based on business reasons. So if we always stick to, the best performers get the biggest raises, it's merit-based, it's performance-based, or it's business-based, and that's how we're making our employment decisions all the way from ads through termination, I think that's the best case scenario for employers. Laws are going to change and go both ways, and this law can change. I think what employers just need to stick to is making fair, consistent decisions based on business reasons in their employment practices, and everything will be great. You do want to be equitable. You do want diversity in your organization, and you certainly want inclusion. You don't want to leave people out, because that's a bad culture, even if we're not talking harassment,
Right.
et cetera. It's utilizing those practices in an inconsistent manner that I believe some of this new legislation is trying to prevent.
This one's going to get a lot of attention real soon here. I think there were so many executive orders signed in such a short period of time that a lot of stuff has gotten buried. We're going to have to unpack this one, but I think your advice is spot on, Mary. It's like, first of all, just don't discriminate, which is consistent with Title VII Civil Rights Act, and just follow the law. Don't discriminate, and make sure that your job postings, your job descriptions are clear. Your job postings are compliant. Your interview process is consistent for all applicants, no matter where they come from and what they look like. And that you just have good, consistent process, good documentation, really just HR best practices. And you're probably fine here. If you do have some specific DEI policies, programs for whatever your reason, it's probably wise to take a hard look at that, given this executive order. We'll have an episode on this topic very soon. So, Brian, Mary, always love talking to you guys. Get smarter every time I do. Anything you want to add in closing?
I'll just go back to what I said at the very beginning, which is at this point, employers need a real HR function with process, with procedures, and a lot of compliance. And we only unpacked some of it. Brian and I could probably talk for 8 hours on this. So there's a lot there. I encourage employers to get that real HR function in place.
Yeah. Brian, anything you want to add?
Yeah, like I echo that. And look, we don't operate based on fear, but we put these things out there. I mean, there's obviously a lot, and an employer who wants to comply with everything, look, there is a lot there. And unfortunately, in the world of employment law, substantial compliance can still leave you, with a big check to pay at the end of the day. So it's building up, an HR framework here, and, not going at it alone. You can't be flying by the seat of your pants when you're at 50 to 149 employees. You really need to have processes in place from, onboarding through termination, and everything between.
Yeah. And for me, it's just, there's something about going for, crossing this 50 employee threshold. There's like two big things happen. Number one is there are new laws you just must comply with. And certainly that was intentionally a big focus of today's conversation. It's also true that now you have employees that work for you that probably aren't family members or friends of friends. You're interacting with, dare I say, strangers who become part of your work family. And that's a new dynamic. You're having supervisors and managers who manage these things. And now you're not the cult of personality for controlling everything that is the culture of the business. And so what is the culture like? What are the processes like? Are these managers actually following processes in best practices? So I think it's inserting a layer of management and supervisors that changes the dynamic so much in an organization. And at the exact same time, when boom, there's a whole bunch more laws you got to comply with. This is not an easy threshold for businesses to cross to get over this 50 employee mark. So invite everybody, suresoftware.com, go to the resources section, download the ebook. Next episode, we are covering our last episode on this topic, growing 150 to 500 plus employees. What are the challenges? What are the systems needed? What are the laws you got to be complying with when you're in this phase of growth? Brian, Mary, thanks again.
Thank you, Mike.
Thanks, Mike.
Everyone else for joining today. Thank you for letting us be part of your mission to grow. That's it for this episode of Mission to Grow. Thanks for joining us today. For show notes and more episodes, visit us at missiontogrow.com. If you found this content valuable, I invite you to share it with a friend and subscribe to the show. If you really want to help, I'd love it if you left a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts, YouTube, or wherever you listen. Mission to Grow is sponsored by Assure. Assure helps more than 100,000 businesses get access to capital, stay compliant, and develop the talent they need to grow. To learn more about how Assure can help your business grow, visit assuresoftware.com. Until next time.